and welcome to the Texas System of Care Cultural and Linguistic Competence Podcast. My name is Shannon Moreno, and I'm the CLC, or Cultural and Linguistic Competence Specialist with Texas System of Care. This podcast is devoted towards how to work with specific populations within your local system of care community, and ensure that you're providing services that are culturally and linguistically appropriate. This series is focused on working with youth who identify as LGBTQ+ and their families. For a further explanation of CLC terminology, including terms used in this podcast, we recommend checking out the ABCs of CLC webinar series. We continue the conversation with Sarah Kapostasy, Clinical Services Director at Out Youth in Austin, Texas. So Sarah, we left off with you talking about how at Out Youth, the staff is looking at how to make sure that LGBTQ+ youth of color are included and are being well served in your services. So when we think about how to best serve youth and make sure that they have positive connections with others, we have to think about all the different ways that the youth identifies, because each layer to who they are will create a new need for relationships and community. So what racial or ethnic group a youth aligns with, or what faith community they belong to, if any, or if they don't have any religious beliefs at all. These all go into understanding the unique needs for connections to community that we want to foster. So how can people working with LGBTQ+ youth make sure that the youth has positive connections with all the communities that they're a member of?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I think the first step for me clinically is, just doing a really thorough job of understanding all the intersectional identities that my clients are bringing to the table. So that's kind of the first step. And I think for all of us, but especially for those of us who, certain aspects of our identity carry privilege and certain don't, and there's different combinations of that, just really chatting through that a little bit. One example that's coming to mind when we were talking about religious spiritual community, one thing we've noticed a lot as a theme with the kiddos that we're serving in school-based services is a real tension there. So we've got a lot of kids reporting to us that, there's been some level of either rejection by a faith community or just feeling like they can't bring their full selves to church on Sunday morning, having a LGBTQIA++ identity. And that can be heartbreaking. So, clinically, that's one thing that it's important to talk through and address. And I have a wonderful colleague who's our lead clinician for school-based services that really worked a lot with a particular youth on that particular tension and did a lot of journaling and, talked about how it affected family relationships, because it wasn't just about the religious or faith community. It was really a way that he connected with family. And, so I think there's a lot of important work to be done in really digging into people's intersectional identities and, talking about how it's impacting them and their relationships and their ability to connect.
Mm-hmm. Another component to this idea of intersectionality and these different layers to how an individual kind of comes together and identifies holistically is that sometimes there's the idea that there are certain identities that could not possibly exist within the same person, and that's simply not true. You can take any, racial ethnic identity and sexual orientation identity and faith identity and cultural background, anything, and mix it together. And there are going to be folks who identify with that specific intersection. So how do you approach, because there's also sometimes with clinicians discomfort about bringing into a room a conversation about spirituality, and particularly when it comes to working with youth who identify as LGBTQ+, it can be difficult to know, is this going to be a traumatizing experience that maybe I should not be bringing into the room, which isn't necessarily how we deal with trauma anyways, but is what sometimes happens. So can you speak to that a little bit about how you can have these sometimes seemingly conflicting identities very much take place in individuals, and in certain communities is more common than others, and how to go about when you actually really get into the weeds of getting to know an individual. How do you kind of open that door into having these conversations?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I would say, I guess for myself, thinking a couple of things. I mean, I tend to work really from a person-centered and relational cultural approach, among other clinical approaches that I use. So I really let, the client lead the way. So in our assessment at OutYouth, we do kind of a semi-structured interview for our initial intake or assessment. And, we try and make it as casual as possible, first of all, while also getting some good information. And we assess around, religious, spiritual identities, beliefs. And if a kiddo's like, ugh, like, that's not for me, like, that's never been a part of my experience, or it was a part of my experience, and, I experienced some rejection around that, then, we know how to approach the situation moving forward, right? And it's just going to be so individualized with every single client. But I think, asking the question and not being afraid to ask the question and just being prepared for what the response might be, and letting the client kind of signal to you, is this something that warrants further sort of conversation and work, or is it something that we can leave alone right now? And I think that's okay too. And I'll just say too, I'll be a little vulnerable. I will say myself as a queer Christian, that's been an interesting journey for me, and just always being really aware of how my own identity may impact, how I approach these particular issues and what I tend to emphasize. And so, I think it's like anything else when we're working clinically, making sure that we're aware of our own sort of countertransference and trying to guard against that as much as possible, and really being centered on where the client's at right now, and what they do or don't want to explore when it comes to any aspect of their lives or identities.
Have you ever yourself or seen or heard of seriously damaging rapport or damaging a professional relationship with someone by asking questions like that?
I can't say that I've experienced that myself clinically, to my knowledge. I mean, I could be wrong. There could be somebody out there that, call in. No, I'm just kidding. Right to Shannon. I'll go back also to my experience in school-based services. I think, once this topic came up, because we lead the curriculum that we do in school-based services by doing an identity wheel. So some of y'all may be familiar with this. So it really asks people to explicitly talk about the various aspects of their identity. And so from the beginning of the groups that we ran last year, and we're going to do a similar activity this year, it was almost like the floodgates opened on that particular question, and people, because we asked, felt safe then to talk about it. And that wasn't in every single group. It certainly didn't become a theme in all of our groups, but in certain groups it was almost like kids were like, well, I'm glad you asked. Like, now I get to talk about it. Now I have license to sort of share the tension and the feelings I've been having related to these identities that, some people are telling me need to be separate but feel very much integrated for me. So.
And I think that unfortunately can happen a lot of times, is when clinicians or just even responsible adults in the life of a youth are not willing to go into these different topics, or are just making assumptions. You identify this way, so you cannot possibly believe this, or of course this is only a source of pain from a certain history or something like that. Then again, that really puts on the shoulders of the youth or whoever it is that we're talking about to navigate that on their own. And oftentimes, and correct me if you've seen something different than this, there are certain things that youth in environments where they know because they've been given very clearly the validation and affirmation you are accepted because of this piece of who you are, that doesn't necessarily mean that the youth knows, and it's not always necessarily the case either, that the youth will be accepted and valued for another component of who they are. So it's this whole idea of intersectionality. It's important across the board, but then sometimes it can be especially kind of swept under the rug in communities that have experienced a lot of history of pain and discrimination from certain other, populations or groupings or beliefs.
Yeah, and I'll just say quickly, I couldn't agree more, A. And B, what really comes to mind as you're talking about that is just there's been many gifts as a clinician that I've received working with this population, but I think one that's helped me overall as a clinician is that piece about not making assumptions and asking the question. Even specifically for, gender identity and sexual orientation, we ask youth on the initial intake form that they fill out for out youth. We ask them their pronouns every single time they enter our drop-in space. And then we ask it again on the intake form explicitly. What's your sexual orientation? What's your gender identity? So we're sort of constantly assessing for that and not making any particular assumptions. And I think another thing working with this population has really helped me with is really just constantly examining my own privilege and not being afraid to bring it into the room. So because I am a cisgender person, I'm a cisgender clinician who happens to work primarily with individual clients that identify somewhere under the trans umbrella, I've gotten really used to owning what that privilege means and owning what it means clinically. So the way I talk about it, oftentimes, sometimes multiple times with my trans-identified clients is, listen, I know transphobia exists. I know because of that, I have certain privileges that have been afforded to me by this culture. So what that means is that, if I start asking questions, for example, about your gender dysphoria, so those feelings you have where your gender identity does not match your sex assigned at birth, and I am crossing any boundaries, you do not have to answer any of my questions. Because I know there's this cisgender fascination with trans bodies going on in our culture that I do not want to perpetrate. And I'm just very transparent about that. And I think what that's helped me to do as well is, as a white woman, I do the same thing with my clients who are people of color. At some point during our relationship, I'm going to end up just owning that, bringing that difference into the room. And I found that with one client in particular, I'm working with a young adult who's a trans man, a Black trans man, and I brought that into the room, and you could almost see him visibly, his shoulders went down. And we had this really awesome conversation about how, he really felt like throughout, his gender affirmation process, he went from somebody who was largely kind of ignored in our culture to somebody who's really feared by our culture. And I don't think that would have ever come up if I hadn't brought it into the room. And so we take risks as clinicians. That's something that we do. And we, of course, want it to be risks within a context of safety. Now, I didn't bring that up with the client our first session, right? Yeah. I think you time it right, and you make sure you have that rapport in place, that you've built that sense of safety, and then you can kind of get into that work that's going to cause or create that sense of kind of first order change within the client.
So Sarah, is it enough? Is it considered culturally appropriate to just treat people as people across the board? So if I'm a clinician and everyone I come across, every client who I work with, I make eye contact, I use affirming, tone of voice, I just kind of exude this warmth type of a thing. Is that it? Is that what we're talking about? Or is there more to it?
I think there's definitely more to it. But I think all the beautiful things you said first, that's that rapport building piece, right? So I think, in some ways, those sort of baseline clinical skills are incredibly important. At the same time, there's another level to it, right? And as you talk about that, what popped into my brain is kind of this idea and this notion of being colorblind, right? That's not a thing. Because that's not what our society and culture has set us up to be. I'll just speak for myself. Like, I can't be colorblind. I'm very much, a product of this culture that has given me a ton of privilege because of the color of my skin. It's not privilege that I asked for, but it's privilege that I have. And I think disregarding that is incredibly disrespectful to a client who has differences from you in whatever way that may be. But of course, we want to, treat people as people in one sense. Like, you are a human being who I want to connect with, and I really do believe, like, Irving Yalom says, it's the connection that heals. And so I think, though, genuine connection is seeing folks for who they are with their variety of intersectional identities. And that's the way that we connect with people.
I hope you enjoyed today's CLC podcast. If you have any questions on how to bring CLC initiatives into your local system of care community, please feel free to email us at info@txsystemofcare.org.